There is a current debate within neurophilosophy and consciousness studies about what is the nature of mind. And this has been debated for a long time. Interestingly, the debate traces back far back into psychology and philosophy. And recently, if we look at the medical model, this is very much based around the idea that the brain is the mind and they're one and the same thing. However, there's a bit more to the debate than might come across on the surface. And if we really engage with this question in depth, we really are confronted with what's called the hard problem of consciousness. And can we explain all of the functions of human behavior and human psychology through the brain alone? And some of the recent research looking at the embodied cognition paradigm, which considers the role of the body and the extended mind, has challenged this notion, especially considering that the brain is the sole contributor to consciousness, or the sole contributor to moment-to-moment experience. So to really tackle this debate, we're confronted with a number of issues that stem from this major question of what is consciousness and what is mind. And certainly if we unpack this word psychology, it traces back to the roots of psyche and this kind of logical way of organizing the psyche. And of course, the word psyche traces back to the origin of the soul, or this spark of consciousness. So interestingly, if we look at practice within the psychiatric and psychological professions today, they're very much grounded on understanding the neural basis of mind. But we've kind of gotten away from this debate of consciousness. We've kind of considered that maybe it's a bit too difficult for us to tackle or to really know what's going on. However, I think it's worthwhile to consider the role that consciousness plays, and to really think about what is the definition that we have of mind. Is it the same thing as the brain, or do we have to consider mind more broadly within this broader spectrum of phenomena? And I think a lot of the time we kind of put these questions to the back burner because they seem a bit too challenging for us to confront, and there's no necessarily clear-cut answers. So in some ways it's easier to deal with clear-cut presumptions that probably the brain is the regulator of consciousness or produces consciousness, and we've just yet to figure out those missing pieces. But if we do play the devil's advocate and think about some of these broader questions related to mind, I think that there's quite a lot to explore within that spectrum, especially if we kind of look back to the traditions earlier on in psychology, those of William James and Abraham Maslow, both of who are really interested in studying broader mind states. And interestingly, both James and Maslow were quite concerned with exploring the broad spectrum of phenomena. William James was known to write about parapsychological or paranormal phenomena like mediumship, like channeling, like visions and so forth. And he actually put forth this hypothesis that psychology should be concerned with studying mental states and the entire scope of mental states. A problem that we can see where this has deviated somewhat is with the introduction of radical behaviorism, and this idea that we should study controlled behavior and what's immediately apparent physiologically. In that, by doing that, we kind of focus on a very narrow band, or a very narrow range of consciousness. So we've almost kind of gotten away from this immense open-ended curiosity and interest and creativity in human psychology that was captured by William James, and have really controlled the scope of the phenomena that we're interested in studying, which is very much what modern psychology is about, being a science that tries to minimize error and minimize variance. However, we also kind of lose a bit of the magic and a bit of the exploration in that. Likewise, looking at some of Maslow's work into peak and plateau states of consciousness, where he was really interested in, what is this quality of experience that someone can look at a piece of artwork in a museum and kind of just dismiss it and say, oh, that's interesting. And another person can really be kind of enamored and in a state of awe looking at this piece of art for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and really being saturated into the experience. Again, how do we measure these sort of states? It's not so easy, but I think we certainly shouldn't lose that curiosity that was captured by some of these earlier theorists and go back to the roots of, what is it that is actually the mind and what is the quality of consciousness. So that's not something, perhaps we can solve straight away by either confirming that the brain and the mind are the same thing or that they're different qualities or components. And certainly if we look at this from a cognitive science perspective, perhaps there's no single clear-cut answer to the hard problem of consciousness. But what we see is theorists now working together across fields in neuroscience and consciousness studies to try to explain some of these unanswered questions. And in cognitive science, this is what we call a process of converging operations. So when we look at trying to explain consciousness or memory or perception, we don't just point to one part of the brain as the explanative source, but we use various different models, both neuroscientific, cognitive, as well as physiological, to try and inform our understanding. And that's where it's really important to head in the field of consciousness studies and in understanding our mind. So this is really the reason that I wanted to launch this series, is to share some of my own thoughts about some of these unanswered questions and bringing to them more of the transpersonal psychology attitude, which has been lost somewhat in these inquiries. In particular, one of the approaches that I found very beneficial is taking this introspective model that William James proposed and looking at the quality and the nature of mind. So we can explore these characteristics very personally in some ways, and this is what psychology has been doing to some extent with the third wave of introducing mindfulness-based practice. So what is it to step back from one's mind? What is it to have that metacognitive or observer-like awareness of one's own thinking process and one's own emotion? And I think therein, we can find some of the, interesting points around this question. If we can step back from our own thinking process, then, how does that work? And if we can step back from our sense of self or sense of personality, then who is doing the stepping back? And this is really where we see, interesting ties back to Eastern philosophy and meditation traditions, which have a lot to teach us about this process as well. So in being able to practice introspective meditation, we can get a bit of a better understanding of what is the nature of our mind and what is the nature of our personal consciousness. So when we unpack this question of what is mind, there's so many things to consider, but a great starting point is to look at your own day-to-day experience. What is it that gives you that holistic state of presence and awareness throughout the day? And you kind of wake up in the morning thinking, this is me, this is who I am. Where does that self-referential awareness come from? And we can certainly, study this to such a degree in the laboratory, but ultimately, how do we study that quality of experience? And I think that comes down to the individual person of, what is it like to have this integrated, holistic experience of self on a day-to-day waking to waking moment. And of course, with the introduction of more advanced computational technology, we have questions around the Turing test and other tests of looking at whether machines and artificial intelligence can be conscious to some extent. And I think, again, we can approach this from the same perspective. How do you know that your subjective experience of consciousness is the same or different to other people around you? Can you quantify that across individuals, around the world, possibly across, artificial systems once computational intelligence becomes more and more advanced? And this really, again, confronts us with this hard problem of consciousness. That consciousness is not really something just to do with pure cognitive output or pure computational output. There seems to be this unique subjective quality that's really worth exploring. And I'll keep this fairly short. So I want to explore a number of topics related to these questions in this mini-series, and I'll continue unpacking each one, hopefully with a short, concise video to get you to think and reflect about some of these points, starting with, what is the nature of mind, and, how do we tackle this issue? Do we simply dismiss it as mind is probably brain, and eventually this will boil down to brain states and neural correlates? Or is there something more that we need to explore within the nature of consciousness, whether it's through this embodied cognition paradigm or this introspective approach of looking inward and trying to understand what the phenomenal nature of consciousness is? So thanks so much for listening. I welcome any comments and look forward to talking to you again in the next video.